Hello. Right. Yes, so as mentioned, my name is, at that point immediately my phone turns off and my notes disappear. Right, try that again. Hi, my name is Andrew Armstrong and my talk is how games learn what happens after they're played. Now I'm a software developer, so my background is in AI, software engineering and architecture, and my involvement in games is mostly around sort of tool development. So let's start with a simple question. I think the theme for this event might be balancing three things in two hands. There we go. So what is the difference between these two buildings? And the answer, of course, is pretty much everything. So this one has an extra floor, this one's got a whole extension, the facades are all different, this one has balconies, so on. Now, these two pictures are actually of the same pair of buildings in New Orleans as they were when they were first built in 1857 and then updated in 1993. And over about 140 years, these buildings have evolved in a series of ways and evolved each in very different directions. Now we tend to think of buildings as stable, static objects because they're built to resist the natural forces of change like weather and sort of wear and tear. But as we see in these pictures, they will inevitably evolve just through a consequence of renovation and adaptation. So there's this guy called Stuart Brand who works on projects like The Long Now, and he became interested in studying how this evolution occurred, what the process was, and if we could feed that process back into the original design. As he described it, architecture was designed as a spatial whole, not a temporal whole. The design thoroughly described the moment when the building was complete, but it didn't consider how it might change in future or how to support that process over time. Now, expanding on the work of Frank Duffy, who was the president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, he divided the way that buildings could develop into 6 shearing layers, which were the site where physically a building is, which tends not to change, the structure, how it's laid out, what the load-bearing elements are, the skin, which is like the doors, the windows, fire escapes, chimneys, that kind of thing, the services, like the utilities, the space plan, where all the rooms go, and the stuff, which is the furniture and the occupants. Now each of those shearing layers is an aspect of the building which can change independently of the layers above it. You can move the chairs around, for example, without rearranging all the plumbing and the foundations. The immediate difference between these layers, apart from physically where they sit in a building, is the rate of change. So going from things working on decades down to hours or days. This is also the order in which a building is designed and then consequently how it's built. The layers also define how a building relates to different groups of people, and that's where it starts to get interesting. So we individually interact with the stuff in the building, like we'll set out a bunch of chairs. The company might handle the space plan, landlords maintain services, and so on through town, city councils, letting agencies, and so on. And it's our interaction with our living and working spaces and our efforts to optimize our environment and remove annoyances that cause the space plan and stuff to change so rapidly, while higher layers are driven by technical progress like installing a new broadband line. So then we go back to the simple kind of trick question we started with. The difference between the two houses is the people that live in those houses because they are main drivers for change. So now, what's this got to do with games? While this model was found by investigating physical architecture, it's actually quite widely applicable to other design problems. It was first introduced in a series of talks given by Pat Helland, formerly an architect at Microsoft, where he translated the idea into layers of software design and the design cultures that spring up in software teams. If we translate the 6 shearing layers to our particular design task, we can reason about the design decisions, which have to happen first, how quickly each piece of the design can be expected to change, at least relative to the others, and how adaptable the final implementation of any part must be to accommodate the kind of ongoing changes as it lives. And we can start by generalizing those layers into the context, the main function, the interface, support functions, and then the overview and detail. And from there we apply it to different situations. Now, I tend to use this model when I'm building procedural generators, as it gives me a template for dividing up a complex creative task. First, I work out the constraints of the generated prototype then I add the vital bits that it needs to do its work. So this would be the major plot points in a narrative, or the drive core in the command center for a spaceship. Then I work out how it interacts with the outside world, so the narrator's point of view for my story, or maybe the landing and docking systems. And then drill deeper and deeper till your generated design is complete. In game design, these look something like this. So the platform and engine is it mobile, is it web, is it Unity? Then there's the core game mechanics, the interface like the graphics, the UI or the controls, the utilities, which are things like the settings menu, tutorial, then you get into level and chapter design, and then finally the interactive elements. So already there are some takeaway points from fitting games into this model. Something I hear very often from writers is that they are brought in at the last minute to add story to an otherwise complete game, generally working on the engineer's assumption that narrative is a kind of independent subsystem that we can slot into a larger model without a great deal of fuss. But looking back at our model, it's clear that you're faced with a choice. Either narrative is a load-bearing part of the game, in which case it needs the freedom to impact the interface, the level design, and the interactive components, or you've relegated it to just stuff, in which case the best it can do is wallpaper over the cracks. We can also start to lay out a game ecosystem of all the people who are involved in the different parts of this. So you have producers, publishers determining the platform and its constraints, game designers with the core mechanics, engineers, developers and artists building the interface and utilities, level designers doing, well, the level design, and then players themselves getting stuck in with the interactive elements. In our metaphor, players are the occupants of our game buildings, and designers, writers and developers are the architects and builders, and as the occupants, players become our main drivers for change. The gaming community also sits on that scale, with modders potentially influencing all the way up to the core mechanics. In sandbox games, players can influence other layers. So in Little Big Planet or Minecraft, we have two versions of players getting to control the level design, while in contrast with Dear Esther, we minimize the interactive elements to just the camera viewpoint. Now on a side note, the very restrictive interaction is largely the same relationship of people to layers as you would see in, say, the British Museum. Curators manage every aspect of the space plan and the stuff, with the only authority left to the occupants, the visitors, being their own perspective. With that in mind, imagine dismissing a museum as an art gallery as just a walking simulator. I mean, it's technically accurate, but you're kind of missing the point. First of all, so how is this actually useful? First of all, we go back to Stuart Brown's warning about designing for spatial and a temporal whole. Planning your game as published, even down to the smallest detail, is not enough. Your game is a process evolving over time, not a fixed destination, with patches, mods, and potentially expansions or DLC stretching out into years. If you incorporate that possibility early, you'll make your own life easier and you'll strengthen the community which builds around your game by encouraging people to get involved constructively. Even in games with seemingly fixed designs, opening up tweakable options gives your players unexpected freedom for creativity. An example of this was the original Halo, way back on the original Xbox, so entirely unmoddable, which had settings open in the multiplayer modes so that my school friends and I could replicate game modes for completely unrelated PC games like the Hunter mode out of AVP2. Now we can also learn from Assemble, who are a group working on urban regeneration. They created an event playground in East Glasgow that changes day by day based on ideas from the children that play there. Their design work isn't in how the playground is laid out or how the materials are used. It covers how the area can adapt to the parents and the children that are using it. In fact, they had children playing on the construction site while they were building it, and they modified it based on what the kids were doing. Paradox are a great example of treating a game like a life cycle rather than a fixed point. Their games are under continual development with a mix of minor patches, major patches and DLC, and a healthy ecosystem for mods. The changes are typically small steps, and the major changes are kind of optional add-ons that you can mostly ignore if you're happy with the game as it is. That flexibility to evolve, often in ways that you hadn't thought of, and making that flexibility available to non-technical players, has important implications for accessibility. Even something as simple as rebinding keys will make your game compatible with custom game controllers. Laying out your text game so it can be fed into a text-to-speech plugin, or making localization files editable so people can add new translations are just simple examples of where accommodating for change in making your game makes it available to otherwise underserved players. The dependencies of each layer also affect the experience of modders. If you allow mods that alter core game mechanics, for example, they'll also need to access the UI and the controls. If a modder adapts your game to VR, they'll need to update the options menu as well to support that functionality. It's pretty much guaranteed that if you don't include that support, someone will find a workaround to make it work. And then you'll be in danger of breaking that every time you publish an update. Early and alpha access has given the same problem from a different direction, before the game is even published. For your players, it's kind of like trying to live in a house while you're still building it, and you keep moving the walls. Having a design that not only considers the final game, but also the transitions that are involved, going from one release to the next, will stop you driving away players as you sort of buffet them with a shifting architecture. The layer dependency should also make clear how fixed any part is, whether you can expect it to change by the time you're finished, how often it's going to change, and where you need to support players to migrate or reset their own pieces of metaphorical furniture, like save games, sandbox creations, or just XP. Even very successful alpha access games, like Minecraft or Kerbal Space Program, have fallen foul of this by making what should be core changes to the game, like introducing an endgame or a management sim late in the development cycle, without redesigning or extending all the lower impacted layers to match. Instead, you have entirely incongruous game features, which are fine on their own, but don't fit with the way the players have been taught to play, and will obstruct play rather than enhance it. Now, I'd like to finish the talk by harking back to a set of VideoBrains talks actually previously from last year on the theme of home, and the idea of players using games to create safe, social or stable spaces for themselves that they might not have access to otherwise. As each player explores, interacts with and tweaks their copy of your game, it diverges further from your original and becomes more of a joint creation, unique to them just like the houses that we started this talk with. And that space is not necessarily just a virtual space for them to play in. Marie Fulston, speaking at the Playful Conference in 2013, talked about the many ways players had adapted their villages in the game Animal Crossing New Leaf. Sometimes replicating a Zelda village, sometimes the Breaking Bad meth lab, and one even telling an entirely original horror story. Marie, in her own Neo Tokyo, shrugs off the judgment of the Happy Home Academy to build something that she lacks in the long commutes between 2 temporary flats and her work. Oh, I'm behind, never mind. I don't care when they slowly tell me how many points on average a house the same size as mine normally has. I need a home, so I choose instead to make myself somewhere I sadly long to live. As the tube rumbles towards the very end of the Piccadilly line, I put on my vintage and apple-shaped TVs, and I head over to my bed, and I sit on the train, watching tiny me napping quietly in the low light. So there we go.